She sighed as she fell into the soft armchair by the window, remembering how weary the day had been. As she closed her eyes for a little moment of comfort, the silence of her opulent home and the weight of her obligations pressing down on her shoulders between meetings, deadlines, and family obligations meant that she seldom had time for herself anymore. Her thoughts were broken by a gentle knock on the door. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" She hadn't given it much thought before, but today his words felt different. "I'm fine." The voice of her servant, a young man who had worked in her home for more than a year, came. He was polite and respectful, but there was always a softness in his voice when he spoke to her. She said, "I'm just tired," trying to brush off the exhaustion that had crept into her bones, "but I could use a little help with these knots in my back." He paused for a moment before entering the room, and then he offered to help her with that. "I learnt some techniques that might help ease the tension." There was a kindness in his offer, and even though it was unexpected, she found herself nodding. She had always thought of him as a part of the household, someone who took care of the things she didn't have time for. But tonight, in her vulnerable state, she realized how little she really knew about him. Tonight, everything felt different. "Thank you," she said, unsure of why she felt so oddly at ease with his presence in such a personal moment. As his hands began to gently knead the tension from her shoulders, she allowed herself to relax into his touch. The room was silent save for the soft rhythm of his hands working on her muscles. At first, she didn't think much of it. It was just a simple gesture, something many would offer to a friend or loved one. But as the minutes passed, she began to feel something she hadn't expected, something warm, subtle, and undeniably comforting. His hands were strong yet gentle, moving with purpose and care. Every movement felt deliberate, as though he truly understood the weight of her stress. With each stroke, the tension in her body slowly melted away. She couldn't remember the last time someone had cared for her this way. In the stillness, she found herself wondering if there was more to this moment than she had initially realized. But as soon as the thought crossed her mind, she dismissed it. She was the employer. He was the servant. That was the extent of their relationship. She had known him for so long, and yet something about this simple act of kindness felt different. "Is this all right?" he inquired in a whispery voice as his fingers moved down her spine, and she blinked briefly in surprise at the sensitivity in his tone. "Yes," she said, her voice a little lower than she meant to. "It feels nice." For a brief moment their eyes met in the mirror across the room. There was something unspoken between them, something that neither of them could name. It was the kind of look that held more weight than words ever could. The tension in the air shifted subtly, but it was there. She tried to focus on her thoughts, tried to distract herself from the strange sensation stirring in her chest, but it was difficult to ignore the warmth spreading through her body. He was so close, his presence so comforting, and yet the proximity made her heart race in a way she hadn't expected. She felt exposed, yet strangely protected as he continued. The rhythm of his hands seemed to synchronize with the beat of her heart. The minutes stretched on, but she didn't want this moment to end. She had no reason to feel so attached to it. After all, he was just her servant, but in that quiet, intimate space, it felt like something more when he finally stepped back, his hands leaving her skin. A quiet sigh escaped her lips. She felt both relieved and disappointed. The moment was over, but the sensation of his touch lingered, as if it had carved something new into the quiet of her mind. "Thank you," she said, turning slightly to face him. "I needed that." She sat in silence, her mind churning in a mixture of perplexity and interest, while he nodded, his expression enigmatic. "I'm glad I could help," and then he left the room, leaving her alone with the weird, fresh warmth that persisted within her. What had just transpired was a straightforward massage, but as she sat there, She couldn't get rid of the feeling that this was the start of something neither of them had foreseen. The following few days went by in a blur of routine, but she could sense that something had changed between them because of the way she looked forward to seeing him around the house, the quiet times when he crossed her path, and the way she found herself thinking about the massage long after it had ended. She also noticed that every time he entered the room, she felt a strange flutter in her chest, as if something unsaid had bound them together in a way she couldn't fully comprehend it. That evening, after a particularly long day, she found herself sitting at her desk, feeling the familiar weight of stress creep up her spine. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise of her thoughts, but the tension would not let go. A gentle knock at the door jolted her out of her reverie. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right?" The phone calls, emails, and paperwork seemed to go on forever, and she could feel the familiar tightness building in her back once more. "You look tense again," came his voice, calm and steady as ever. Without thinking, she looked up, her mind instantly drawn to the memory of his touch. "Actually, I could use a little help again," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "I'm really tense today." He stepped inside his usual professional demeanor in place, though there was something different in the way he carried himself. She could sense it, the same undercurrent of unspoken words that had lingered since their last encounter as he approached. She noticed how his eyes seemed to hesitate just for a moment before they met hers. It was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. "Would you like me to help with your back again?" he asked, his voice slightly lower than usual. She could hear the faintest edge of uncertainty in his tone, as if he were unsure whether he should even be asking, but she found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "Yes, please," she said quietly, her heart unexpectedly racing, as he began, his hands once again pressed gently into her shoulders, moving with deliberate, soothing motions. There was a new tension in the air between them, thick and palpable. Her muscles, which had been stiff with stress, seemed to loosen at the first touch. But this time, it wasn't just the physical relief she was feeling. It was something deeper. His hands were moving with a care that felt almost personal, too intimate for what she had imagined. Days turned into weeks, and the unspoken tension between them grew. She found herself restless in his presence, her thoughts drifting to him in the quiet moments of the day. At first, she tried to dismiss it, rationalizing that it was just the result of stress and exhaustion. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more the feeling seemed to intensify. Her interactions with him became more charged. The simple acts of him handing her a cup of tea or adjusting the curtains at her request now carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. It was as if their every glance and every brush of their hands was infused with a current neither could name. She caught herself lingering longer than usual in his presence, not out of necessity, but because she didn't want to let go of the connection that had begun to form between them. One evening, after an especially taxing day, she found herself standing by the window, staring out at the city lights below, lost in thought. Her back was aching again, a familiar reminder of the long hours she had spent hunched over her desk. The tension was almost unbearable now. A constant companion without thinking, she called out to him, her voice soft, betraying her vulnerability. "Could you help me again with my back?" He had been providing her with regular support over the past few weeks, but tonight something felt different. She wasn't sure if it was the quiet urgency in his tone or the fact that she had never needed this comfort as much as she did. He entered the room, and as he moved towards her, she could see the familiar warmth in his gaze. But now there was something else there, something more intimate, something bolder. She asked the words, and before she could stop herself, he responded almost instantly. She quickly looked away, trying to compose herself, but the flutter in her chest didn't subside. It only grew stronger. "Let me help you get comfortable," he said, his voice low as if aware of the tension that hung in the air between them. She nodded, unsure of what to say, her heart beating faster than she could explain. He worked gently, his hands moving to her shoulders with practiced ease, but this time it felt different. There was more intention behind his touch, an undeniable care in the way his fingers worked to ease the tension in her muscles. Each press of his palms seemed to linger just a bit longer, as though he too was reluctant to break the moment his hands were warm, firm, and steady. And she found herself leaning into them, craving the comfort he offered as he moved down her back. The sensation of his hands gliding over her skin sent a wave of heat through her. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but it was impossible to ignore how his touch stirred something deep within her. Her thoughts, once clear and focused, now seemed muddled. She could feel the quiet pull between them, a magnetic force neither of them had acknowledged until now. "How does that feel?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His question simple as it was held a weight that made her heart skip a beat. She swallowed, trying to steady herself before replying. "It feels good," she said, her voice soft and almost breathless. She hated how vulnerable she sounded, but there was no turning back now. She couldn't pretend that this moment didn't mean something more. His hands paused for a moment, and for the briefest of seconds, everything seemed to stop. The air felt heavy, thick with the unspoken understanding between them. Her heart raced as she tried to regain her composure, but the heat from his touch lingered, settling deep within her. "I'm glad," he said, his voice sounding almost too calm, but she could hear the subtle change in it, the way it betrayed his own struggle to keep his distance. As he continued, his movements seemed to change. There was a softness in his touch, a tenderness that she hadn't noticed before, the way his hands worked. Her muscles was almost like an expression of care, of something beyond the professional. She felt her body responding, the warmth of his touch spreading through her, igniting a longing she couldn't ignore. She told herself it was just a massage, that it was nothing more than him doing his job. But the longer he stayed, the more impossible it became to deny the growing feelings between them. He was more than just a servant. Now he was someone who had touched her in ways no one else had, not just physically, but emotionally. The lines between employer and servant were blurring, and she couldn't help but wonder where this would lead. When he finished, his hands finally left her back, and the silence that followed was deafening. She sat up slowly, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The connection between them was undeniable, but she wasn't sure what it meant or how to navigate it. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual. She felt the words hanging between them, carrying a weight neither of them could ignore. He nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes. It was as if he too recognized the shift, but neither of them spoke about it. Instead, he simply said, "You're welcome," before quietly leaving the room, leaving her with the lingering sensation of his touch and the undeniable pull that now connected them in ways neither of them could fully understand. The next morning brought no clarity, only a quiet storm inside her. She moved through her routine distractedly, the memory of his touch following her like a whisper. It wasn't just physical, it was how seen she felt in that moment, how present he had been without saying a word. She tried to pretend nothing had changed, but something had within her, and possibly within him too. They didn't speak about it, not directly, but every interaction now had a subtle pause, a charged silence before words found their way. She noticed how he looked at her, not with boldness, but with careful intention, like someone who'd crossed a line. He wasn't sure he should have, yet didn't regret. She wondered if he lay awake the way she did, questioning what this connection meant. What future, if any, it had later that week. She called for him again, not because her back hurt, but because she needed to feel that closeness, that safety he entered with his usual calm. But his eyes held a question he didn't ask aloud. She offered him a smile soft and uncertain. It was enough he began without a word, and the silence between them was no longer awkward. It was intimate, his touch was familiar now, but still sent a rush of warmth through her. It felt like their own unspoken language. His hands saying everything they both were too cautious to voice. She leaned into it, not just physically, but emotionally, allowing herself to be vulnerable again in his presence. For the first time, she let herself speak while he worked. She told him she appreciated him, that she noticed how kind he always was, how gentle he didn't say much back, but his hands slowed, his touch grew even more careful, and that said more than words ever could. There was respect in the way he handled her, an understanding that what they shared was delicate, real, and not to be taken lightly.